The conning tower watch barely had time to scream the warning. 3 seconds later, the water erupted in 7 white columns, each depth charge detonating with the force of a sledgehammer against the submarine's pressure hull. Inside U-463, the lights flickered once, then died. In the pitch darkness, 46 men stopped breathing, waiting to hear if the rivets would hold. They didn't. The Atlantic swallowed them in less than a minute. 400 miles away, Korvettenkapitän Hans-Joachim Schwanke surfaced his boat in what he believed was safe darkness. His METOX receiver had been silent for 2 hours, its steady hum indicating no Allied radar in range. The crew stumbled onto the bridge, gasping at the fresh air after 8 hours submerged, the diesel engines coughing to life below. Then the searchlight found them, a column of white fire stabbing through the night with 22 million candle power, the Lais light. By the time Schwanke's eyes adjusted enough to see the aircraft diving toward him, the depth charges were already falling. May 1943. German submariners would come to call it Black May. If you want to understand why, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because what happened in those 31 days represents one of the most dramatic technological turning points in military history. The North Atlantic in early 1943 was the most contested battlefield on Earth. Beneath those gray swells, the outcome of the entire war hung in balance. Britain survived on the cargo those convoys carried: grain from Canada, oil from Texas, aircraft from American factories, ammunition, machinery, the sinews of war. Cut those supply lines, and Churchill's island fortress would starve. Hold them open, and the Allies could mass the resources to invade Europe. Admiral Karl Dönitz commanded Germany's U-boat force with a mathematician's precision. His strategy was elegant in its brutality: sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them. Through 1942, he was winning that race. His submarines had sent nearly 8 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. The equation was simple. Germany could build U-boats faster than Britain could construct destroyers. Each submarine could sink multiple freighters before facing significant risk. Time, Dönitz calculated, favored Germany. Then something changed. The U-boats began dying. Not occasionally, not in acceptable numbers, but in catastrophic quantities that made the losses unsustainable. In the first 3 weeks of May alone, 28 U-boats simply vanished. By month's end, the toll reached 41 submarines lost at sea, with 3 more destroyed to port. Nearly 300 Allied merchant ships crossed the Atlantic that month. The U-boats managed to sink only 50,000 tons. The mathematics that had sustained Dönitz's confidence for 3 years had inverted. The submariners noticed it first in the quality of the attacks. Aircraft were finding them in conditions that should have made detection impossible. Fog, darkness, heavy seas. None of it mattered anymore. The planes came anyway, materializing out of weather that grounded visibility at 50 meters, their depth charges already calibrated for the kill. Boats that maintained strict radio silence, that followed every doctrine for stealth, died as readily as those that broke protocol. Dönitz demanded answers. His intelligence staff reported what they knew. British radar operated on 1.5-meter wavelengths. German METOX receivers could detect those transmissions at ranges exceeding the radar's own detection capability. The system gave U-boat commanders advance warning, time enough to dive to safety. That technology had worked for months. So why were boats equipped with functioning METOX dying to radar-directed attacks? One theory suggested the METOX itself was betraying them. Perhaps Allied aircraft had developed receivers that homed in on the METOX's own emissions, turning Germany's defensive tool into a beacon, marking each submarine's position. Dönitz took the possibility seriously enough to order boats to stop using their METOX receivers. The slaughter accelerated. Whatever was killing the U-boats, it wasn't the METOX. The truth was crossing the Atlantic in the bomb bays of RAF Coastal Command Liberators and Wellingtons, installed in wing pods and ventral turrets. ASV Mark III, a radar system operating on a wavelength so short that German technology couldn't detect it, 10 centimeters. The METOX, calibrated for meter-length waves, was completely blind to this new frequency. The story of that radar begins in a laboratory at Birmingham University in February 1940. Two physicists, John Randall and Harry Boot, received an assignment that seemed nearly impossible: develop a device capable of generating powerful radio waves at wavelengths below 10 centimeters. Every radar system in operation used wavelengths measured in meters. Those long waves required enormous antennas and provided crude resolution. A destroyer and a submarine's conning tower produced similar radar returns. Worse, at night or in fog, aircraft radar had a minimum effective range of about a mile due to sea clutter. That final mile became a blind zone where U-boats could dive to safety before the aircraft closed to attack range. Shorter wavelengths would solve both problems. They would allow smaller antennas while providing dramatically better resolution. The ocean surface would return a different signature than a steel conning tower. But generating powerful radio waves at centimetric wavelengths required technology that didn't exist. Randall and Boot's breakthrough came from reimagining the magnetron, a vacuum tube that used powerful magnets and resonant cavities to produce oscillating radio waves. Previous magnetron designs were laboratory curiosities, bulky devices that needed vacuum pumps and massive electromagnets. They produced the right wavelengths, but lacked the power for practical radar. The Birmingham team's innovation was elegant. They incorporated the resonant cavities directly into the anode, creating a compact, self-contained unit. On their first test, the device produced 400 watts at 9.8 centimeters. Within weeks, they achieved kilowatt-level output. The implications were staggering: a radar powerful enough for airborne use, with an antenna small enough to fit in an aircraft, operating at wavelengths that would paint a detailed picture of the ocean surface. The engineers at General Electric Company in Wembley transformed Randall and Boot's laboratory prototype into a production model. By August 1940, they had a working unit ready for field testing. Churchill recognized what it meant. He authorized the teasered mission to carry a cavity magnetron to the United States, sharing Britain's most valuable technological secret with American engineers. The official historian would later write that it was the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. American engineers at MIT's Radiation Laboratory received the device and began their own development program. Production ramped up through 1942. By early 1943, ASV Mark III radars were entering service with RAF Coastal Command. The first U-boat crews had no idea what killed them. Their METOX receivers showed clear skies. Then the lee light would snap on, that impossible column of brightness in ocean darkness, and the depth charges would fall. The new radar could detect a surfaced submarine at ranges exceeding 20 miles. A conning tower alone showed up at 8 miles. The aircraft could track the submarine through the final approach, the radar display showing range decreasing 5 miles, 3 miles, 1 mile. Then, at the last 1,000 feet, the lee light would ignite. The searchlight beam was 28 inches across, powered by a carbon arc that produced 22 million candle power. It could illuminate a submarine at ranges where the crew's night-adapted eyes were useless against the glare. The combination was lethal: radar for detection and tracking, the lee light for the final attack run. U-boat commanders had no counter. They couldn't detect the radar. They couldn't dive fast enough once the light found them. A Type 7 U-boat needed 30 seconds to clear the bridge and seal the hatches before beginning its dive. In 30 seconds, a Liberator traveling at 200 knots covered nearly 2 nautical miles. The mathematics of interception had become impossible for the submarines. But it wasn't just the technology. The Allies had learned how to use it. Coastal command crews trained relentlessly on their radar systems, learning to distinguish a submarine's signature from wave clutter. They developed tactics for different sea states, understanding how to adjust their sets for maximum sensitivity without losing targets in false returns. The Mark III included refinements specifically for anti-submarine work, a height scope for precise altitude measurement, a timing system integrated with a lee light, modifications that eliminated wave clutter in moderate seas. March 1943 marked the operational debut of ASV Mark III in significant numbers. The results were immediate and devastating. Convoy ONS-5 crossed the North Atlantic in early May. U-boats attempted to attack it 26 times. Aircraft equipped with the new 10-centimeter radar detected every single approach. Not one submarine managed to press home an attack. Life aboard a U-boat had always been brutal. The Type 7, the workhorse of Germany's submarine fleet, measured 220 feet long and 20 feet wide. Into that steel tube, the Kriegsmarine packed 44 men, 14 torpedoes, diesel fuel, provisions for a patrol lasting 6 to 8 weeks, and enough compressed air for the ballast tanks. Space wasn't measured in rooms, but in inches. Crew members slept in bunks stacked 3 high, squeezed between torpedo racks and machinery. Hot bunking was standard. As one man rose for his watch, another would crawl into the still warm bunk. Fresh water existed only for drinking. Washing was forbidden. The boat carried diesel fuel in one of the water tanks to extend operational range. Men wore the same clothes for the entire patrol, using deodorant to manage body odor that became overpowering in the submarine's confined atmosphere. Fresh food spoiled within days, contaminated by diesel fumes that permeated everything. The crew subsisted on canned goods, eaten cold because cooking added heat and moisture to air that was already saturated. The worst was the air itself. A fully equipped Type 7 contained about 400 cubic meters of oxygen. After 5 hours submerged, carbon dioxide levels reached 1.5%. At 2.5%, cognitive function deteriorated. The boat carried alkaline cartridges for air purification and oxygen cylinders for emergencies. Submariners lived in a perpetual state of controlled suffocation, their bodies adapting to oxygen levels that would leave surface dwellers gasping. Standing watch on the conning tower during North Atlantic storms was its own torment. Icy waves swept over the bridge constantly, completely submerging the watch crew for seconds at a time. The men wore heavy weather gear, but the cold penetrated everything. 4 hours of that duty left men shaking uncontrollably, hypothermic even in summer months. Then the radar changed everything. Suddenly, surfacing carried a risk that made the mathematics of survival impossible. A U-boat had to surface to charge batteries. The electric motors that powered submerged operations drew from battery banks that needed recharging every 24 hours. That meant running the diesel engines, which meant operating on the surface. Before centimetric radar, submarines surfaced at night, using darkness as protection. Lookouts could spot aircraft at distances sufficient for a crash dive. ASV Mark III eliminated that margin. The radar could detect a submarine in complete darkness, through fog, in heavy seas that made visual spotting impossible. Aircraft approached from downwind, their engines masked by the wind noise that drowned out all sound on the conning tower. The first warning a U-boat crew received was often the lee light snapping on, illuminating them at ranges measured in hundreds of meters. By then, the depth charges were already falling. Oberleutnant Sergei Rolf Mützelberg commanded U-203 through 2 years of Atlantic patrols. He survived 31 convoys, sent 21 Allied ships to the bottom. In July 1942, he brought his boat home from its 11th patrol. The crew had been at sea for 63 days. They were 7 days from the French coast, from real food and fresh water, and beds that didn't rock. An aircraft found them on the surface in pre-dawn darkness. The radar worked perfectly. Mützelberg never saw it coming. U-203 went down with all hands. That same month, Coastal Command aircraft sank 5 U-boats. In August, the toll reached 6. September claimed 7 more. Dönitz noticed the trend, but the numbers weren't yet catastrophic. Submarines still sank more tonnage than they lost. Then came May 1943. The first week cost Germany 7 U-boats. The second week, another 9 vanished. By mid-month, Dönitz's war diary reflected growing alarm. U-boat command was losing submarines faster than the shipyards could build them. The exchange rate had inverted catastrophically. In March, 40 U-boats had sunk nearly 600,000 tons of Allied shipping. In May, 90 submarines operating in the North Atlantic managed to sink 50,000 tons while losing 41 of their number. The submariners knew they were dying. Every patrol became a statistical nightmare. Of the 41,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 30,000 would die. That's a casualty rate of 75%. It made U-boat service the most lethal military assignment of any branch, of any nation, in the entire war. RAF Bomber Command, famous for its horrific losses over Germany, suffered a 44% casualty rate. U-boat crews died at nearly double that frequency. Many boats were lost on their first patrol. Of the 181 U-boats commissioned during the war, 215 went down before completing even one successful mission. Fresh crews, newly trained, sailed from French ports and simply disappeared. No distress calls, no survivors, just silence where a submarine should have reported its position. The Atlantic swallowed them, and only after the war, when researchers matched German records against Allied after-action reports, did the full scope of the slaughter become clear. U-954 sailed from Kiel on its first patrol in March 1943. The crew was young, average age 22, commanded by an Oberleutnant on his second command. They made it 3 weeks. A Liberator from 120 Squadron found them surfaced south of Iceland. The ASV Mark III painted a perfect picture of the submarine at 12 miles range. The Liberator's pilot, Flying Officer Ramsden, maneuvered to approach from the sun. The U-boat crew never saw him. 7 depth charges fell from 50 feet. The submarine's pressure hull shattered instantly. All 46 men died in the explosions or drowned in the flooding that followed. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. That was how they died now. Quick, brutal, without warning or chance of survival. The depth charges used by Coastal Command aircraft in 1943 were far more lethal than earlier versions. The Torpex explosive filling detonated with 70% more force than TNT. Set to detonate at 25 feet depth, a standard pattern of 6 to 8 charges created an underwater shock wave that could crush a submarine's hull even without direct hits. Men trapped inside experienced the pressure wave as a physical blow that ruptured organs and shattered bones. Those who survived the initial detonations drowned as seawater flooded through split seams and blown hatches. The submariners had no illusions about their chances. U-boat veterans told new crews to enjoy their final leave, to say their goodbyes, because the odds said they weren't coming back. By late 1943, the average operational life of a U-boat was measured in weeks. A submarine might complete 1 patrol, possibly 2. 3 patrols made a crew veterans. 4 was nearly unheard of, yet they kept sailing. Dönitz ordered them out, and they went. Partly from discipline, partly from the camaraderie that develops among men facing shared annihilation. They knew the statistics. They understood that 3 out of 4 wouldn't survive the war, but each crew believed they might be the lucky ones, the 25%, who would see Germany again. The German Navy tried to develop countermeasures. Engineers created the Wannsee radar detector, designed to pick up 10-centimeter transmissions that METOX missed. It helped briefly. Then Allied radar switched to frequencies that Wanza couldn't detect. The cycle repeated with Naxos, an improved receiver that theoretically covered the full radar spectrum. By the time Naxos entered service in late 1943, it no longer mattered. The U-boat force was already broken. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Dönitz composed a message to all U-boats operating in the North Atlantic. The text was brief, the implications staggering: withdraw from the convoy routes. After nearly 4 years of continuous operations, Germany was ceding control of the Atlantic. The submarines would redeploy to other hunting grounds: the Caribbean, the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean. Anywhere that Allied air power wasn't so overwhelming, some boats tried to return to the fight. In September 1943, Dönitz ordered a renewed offensive against North Atlantic convoys. It lasted 3 weeks. Aircraft equipped with ASV Mark III detected every submarine that surfaced within 300 miles of the convoy routes. The U-boats that survived limped back to France, having achieved nothing except confirming that the Atlantic was lost. The technology continued evolving. Coastal Command introduced rocket projectiles in June 1943. These weapons were simpler than depth charges, cheaper to manufacture, and devastatingly effective. A spread of 8 rockets, each carrying a 25-pound warhead, produced a hit probability of 30%. A single hit on a surface submarine was lethal. The first confirmed kill using rocket projectiles came on June 4, 1943, when a Sunderland from 48 Squadron caught U-594 on the surface. The rockets punched through the pressure hull like it was sheet metal. The submarine sank in less than a minute. The Germans tried making their submarines harder to detect. Rubber coatings were developed to absorb radar waves. Tests showed the material could reduce radar returns by up to 90%. But the coating added weight and reduced underwater speed. Worse, it degraded quickly in seawater, requiring frequent replacement that tied boats to dock facilities. The schnorkel, a breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged, offered better protection. U-boats equipped with schnorkel could remain underwater for extended periods, charging batteries without surfacing. But the device created its own wake, visible to radar, and reduced the boat's already limited underwater speed. None of it changed the fundamental reality. Allied technology had leaped ahead, and German countermeasures couldn't close the gap. British and American engineers weren't standing still. Every German innovation met an Allied response that negated it within months. The cavity magnetron had opened a technological pathway that led to multiple innovations: improved radar displays, better signal processing, integration with other sensors. By 1944, some aircraft carried radar systems that could detect a schnorkel from 15 miles away. The human cost was staggering on both sides. Nearly 3,000 Allied merchant ships went to the bottom, along with 175 warships. Tens of thousands of merchant seamen died in the freezing Atlantic, their ships torpedoed from beneath by enemies they never saw. But the U-boat force suffered proportionally worse losses. Of the 785 submarines lost during the war, 648 went down with no survivors. Entire crews, 40 to 50 men per boat, vanished in seconds when the pressure hull failed. U-boat commanders who survived the war spoke about May 1943 with a particular horror. Peter Kremer, who commanded U-333, described the helplessness of sailing into conditions where the enemy could see through darkness, through fog, through the ocean itself. "We were blind," he said, "and they had eyes everywhere." Hans Joachim Schwanke, one of the few who survived multiple patrols after May 1943, wrote about the psychological impact of fighting an invisible enemy. "You knew they were there," he recalled. "You knew they could see you, and there was nothing you could do except pray they were looking somewhere else." The psychological pressure broke men. Living in conditions that would be considered torture in any other context, knowing that every time the boat surfaced might be the last time, watching sister submarines disappear one after another. It created trauma that no amount of training could prepare crews for. By late 1943, some U-boat crews refused to sail. Courts-martial and firing squads became necessary to maintain discipline. The Kriegsmarine was feeding men into a meat grinder, and everyone involved knew it. The technology that defeated the U-boats didn't stop at radar. High-frequency direction finding allowed Allied shore stations to track U-boat radio transmissions. Improved sonar gave escort vessels better underwater detection capabilities. The Allies developed ahead-throwing weapons like Hedgehog, which could attack a submarine without the attacking ship having to pass directly over the target. Escort carriers brought air power to the middle of the Atlantic, closing the air gap where long-range land-based aircraft couldn't operate. But the cavity magnetron radar was the keystone. It enabled all the other systems to function effectively. Aircraft could find submarines in conditions that rendered visual search useless. Surface ships could track contacts at ranges where sonar was ineffective. The improved resolution allowed operators to distinguish between submarines and whales, between periscopes and debris. The technology didn't just give the Allies an advantage, it fundamentally changed the nature of anti-submarine warfare. Consider the numbers. In 1942, Coastal Command aircraft sank 31 U-boats. In 1943, that number jumped to more than 100. The increase coincided directly with the introduction of ASV Mark III. Aircraft using the new radar achieved kill rates 3 times higher than earlier systems. The Mark III's ability to track targets through the final approach, combined with the Lee light for visual confirmation, turned night patrols from harassment missions into lethal hunter-killer operations. The strategic implications rippled outward. With the U-boat threat neutralized, the Allies could mass shipping for the invasion of Europe. The beaches of Normandy were conquered as much in the laboratories of Birmingham and the factories of General Electric as in the landing craft crossing the Channel. Every tank, every artillery piece, every ton of ammunition that landed in France came across an Atlantic that had been made safe by 10-centimeter radar waves. The war continued for nearly 2 more years after May 1943. U-boats kept sailing, kept hunting, kept dying. Dönitz ordered them out until the last days of the war, believing that tying down Allied anti-submarine resources served a strategic purpose, even if the submarines achieved little else. In April 1945, with Germany in ruins and defeat inevitable, U-boats were still putting to sea. They sank their last merchant ship on May 7, 1945, one day before the German surrender. By then, 739 U-boats had been destroyed. Some were sunk by surface ships, some by mines, some by accident. But aircraft equipped with cavity magnetron radar accounted for a disproportionate share of the kills. The technology that John Randall and Harry Boot developed in a Birmingham laboratory in 1940 had, by 1945, turned the Atlantic Ocean into a graveyard for submarines. The irony is that U-boat crews never fully understood what killed them. German intelligence suspected the Allies had developed shorter wavelength radar, but the details remained murky until after the war. Submariners sailed into the dark, their meat-tox receivers silent, confident in their invisibility. Then the aircraft would appear, impossibly precise in their interceptions, and the depth charges would fall. The crews died not knowing that the device hunting them fit in a package smaller than a typewriter, generating radio waves at frequencies their detectors couldn't receive. The cavity magnetron's descendants surround us now. Every microwave oven operates on the same principle Randall and Boot discovered. The global market for microwave ovens exceeds $12 billion annually. But in 1943, that technology had exactly one purpose: finding submarines on the surface of the Atlantic and killing the men inside them. The survivors carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Men who spent months in the claustrophobic hell of a U-boat, who watched friends die in seconds when depth charges found their mark, who surfaced each night not knowing if radar had already marked them for death. The casualty statistics were bad enough, 75% killed. But the survivors had to live with the knowledge that they were the lucky minority. That statistical chance alone determined who came home and who stayed in the Atlantic. Admiral Dönitz spent the last decades of his life analyzing what went wrong. In his memoirs and interviews, he kept returning to May 1943, the moment when the equation flipped and Germany lost the Battle of the Atlantic. He identified multiple factors: Allied air power, improved convoy tactics, better weapons. But the common thread was technology. The Allies had achieved breakthroughs that German science couldn't match. The cavity magnetron was the most significant, but not the only one. What makes the story remarkable isn't just the technology itself, but the speed of its development and deployment. From Randall and Boot's first prototype in February 1940 to mass production of ASV Mark III by early 1943, barely 3 years. In that time, British and American engineers transformed a laboratory curiosity into a weapon system that changed the course of the war. The bureaucratic and organizational efficiency required to achieve that development timeline, especially during wartime, represents an achievement as significant as the technology itself. The Germans had capable scientists and engineers. They understood radar theory, but they lacked the systematic innovation process that characterized British and American development programs. Individual brilliance wasn't enough when competing against organizations designed to transform ideas into production systems at industrial scale. The cavity magnetron's path from Birmingham Laboratory to Coastal Command aircraft demonstrates what happens when scientific innovation aligns with strategic vision and industrial capacity. For the men in the U-boats, those organizational abstractions meant nothing. They experienced the results as aircraft that found them in impossible conditions, as depth charges that fell with uncanny accuracy, as friends and crewmates who went to sea and never returned. The technology was invisible to them. They couldn't detect the radar. They couldn't understand how Allied aircraft achieved interception probabilities that shouldn't have been possible. They just knew they were dying, and nothing they did changed that fundamental reality. May 1943 marked the point where the killing reached levels that made continued operations suicidal. Dönitz's withdrawal order on May 24th acknowledged a truth that had become unavoidable. The U-boats could no longer operate in the North Atlantic without suffering unsustainable losses. The submarines would spend the rest of the war searching for hunting grounds where Allied technology wasn't so overwhelming. They never found them. Radar continued improving, extending its reach into every ocean. The submarines had nowhere left to hide. The final accounting is sobering. Germany built 1,181 U-boats during the war. Of those, 785 were destroyed. Another 222 were scuttled by their own crews as the war ended. Only 174 survived to surrender to Allied forces. The human cost was worse: 30,000 dead out of 41,000 who served. 3 out of every 4 men who put on a U-boat crew's uniform never came home. The unlucky drowned in flooded compartments or froze in the water before rescue arrived. Almost none were rescued. The North Atlantic doesn't give up its dead easily. U-boat crews never expected airborne radar to turn the Atlantic Ocean into a graveyard. They trained for surface combat, for convoy attacks, for the tactics that had worked through 1942. Then the technology changed. The darkness that had protected them became transparent. The ocean that had hidden them became a killing ground, where aircraft hunted with the precision of wolves, running down wounded prey. And 30,000 submariners paid the price for operating a weapon system that had become obsolete before they understood what was hunting them. The cavity magnetron won the Battle of the Atlantic as surely as any warship or submarine. 10 centimeters of wavelength, hundreds of watts of power, small enough to fit in an aircraft and powerful enough to paint the ocean's surface with clarity that made submarines visible in any weather, day or night. That was the weapon that defeated the U-boats. Not bullets or depth charges, though those did the killing. The real weapon was information, knowing where the submarines were before they knew they'd been found. Technology gave the Allies that knowledge, and it made all the difference. No other military organization in any nation suffered comparable casualties. Those numbers represent individual tragedies multiplied thousands of times over. Young men, most barely out of their teens, sealed into steel tubes and sent into an ocean where technology had made their missions suicide. They followed orders, maintained discipline, and died in the dark waters of the Atlantic. The lucky ones went quickly when depth charges crushed their submarines.